Hello, it's Mr. Wood here. Welcome to our second lesson on Theme D, Religion, Peace and Conflict. Our lesson today is on violence and violent protest. Our objectives today are to understand what is meant by violence, protest and violent protest, and to consider whether or not religious people should ever take part in violent protests. Your need to know today is this. On the whole, violence is seen as evil by most religious people. However, for some, it is a necessary evil that could and should be utilised to bring about good outcomes. Okay, so let's jump in and start by thinking about this concept of violence. So the dictionary definition of violence is up there on the screen. It's behaviour involving physical force intended to hurt, damage or kill someone or something. That's what violence is. It's using physicality to harm someone. Now, when we consider what violence is, when we think about it and we look at religious responses to it, you could say there was a whole spectrum of different responses to it. Starting from one end of the spectrum with people who would say that violence is evil, that violence in itself is wrong, that there is never a good reason to use violence because it is evil. If we move across that spectrum to the middle there, you'll see that term, a necessary evil. So some religious people would say, yes, violence is evil, but occasionally it's a necessary evil. So we're going to look at a couple of wars, for example. World War II is the classic one where people say, you know, war is wrong, but Hitler was very evil, and if we didn't use war to stop that movement from occurring, the Nazi movement, worse things would have happened. And so for some, violence can be a lesser of two evils. When we move to the other end of the spectrum, there are people who might say they're neutral about violence. Violence in itself is not right or wrong. It's just a tool that can be used to solve a problem. So they're not pro-violence, but they're not anti-violence necessarily either. They might say that violence is the right tool to use sometimes to solve a problem. When we look at the teachings of Jesus, it's very hard to find anything he says that condones any sort of violence. So famously, he came along and he said, well, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. He teaches turn the other cheek. If you get hit, don't respond, let him hit you as well. He said, love your enemies. He taught and he demonstrated in his life that fighting back wasn't acceptable. There's a couple of obscure quotes you might find from him, like he says when he's describing the end times, to if you don't have a sword, to sell your cloak and buy one. But that's kind of one passage pulled out amongst all of the very peaceful and pacifist statements that he made. But we're going to open that up a little bit more as we go through this course. But just a thought for you there today. If we now start to think about protest, to look at the definition of that word, you'll see that protest is a statement or action expressing disapproval or objection to something. I.e., protest is when something's occurring that you don't agree with and you stand up and you say something about it. That's what you're doing when you're protesting. You're saying no to something that's occurring at the time. And you'll see there's been huge protests on the news over the last few years. Black Lives Matter at the moment is a huge protest movement that you'll see all over the television and the internet at the moment. A few years back, there were protests in England about student fees going up. And there's often protests going on in some variety. If you go into the city of London, normally not during COVID times at all, you'll see different protesters, different marches going on for different things. But effectively, it's standing up and saying, I don't agree with that. And that's what protesting is. If we look through the history of Christianity, if we look back through the Bible, you'll see that in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, there's stories of Isaiah, of Jeremiah, of different prophets who stood up to the institutions at the time and said, hey, this is wrong. God's got a plan. God teaches us to be doing this, and you're making us do this, and that's wrong. And they protested against what was occurring. In the history of the church, you've got the Protestant movement, people who stood up to the Catholic Church and said, we don't agree with this and this, and we're going to protest against that. And that's what started the Protestant movement in the Reformation, when people moved away from the Catholic Church. So protest has its place in Christianity. When we look in the Bible, here's a great verse from Isaiah. Isaiah writes this as a message from God. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, and take up the cause of the fatherless and plead the case of the widow. Now that is protest. It's standing up, and in this example, it's not for yourself, it's standing up for people who don't have a voice for themselves and protesting when people are receiving unjust treatment or unfair treatment or being abused. And then it's right to protest. And many Christians, many religious people would say there is a responsibility to protest. When you see that something is wrong and you don't do anything about it, that is a sin in itself. Martin Luther King said famously, all that's needed for evil men to prosper is for good men to do nothing. And so not protesting for a lot of religious people, if you see something that's wrong, is a sin. Let's move on now and think about violent protest. So we know what violence is, we know what protest is. What about violent protest? Well, violent protest is when you're standing up and you're saying no and you're taking a stand against something, but you're choosing to use violent methods to do that. So I've mentioned Martin Luther King already. Famously, Martin Luther King and Gandhi were two religious people inspired by Jesus' Sermon on the Mount to turn the other cheek and not take revenge, and use that non-violent protest methods to make a change. And you'll know from history that Gandhi and Martin Luther King were both incredibly successful at using non-violent protest methods to get their message across in a really powerful way. However, not everyone agrees with non-violent protest methods, and some people choose to use violent protest methods because they feel it's going to have, well, there's a few reasons they might do it. They might have tried non-violent protest methods and feel like they hadn't been heard or their message hadn't got across and then move to violent methods. Or they may just feel that the situation they find themselves in warrants a violent response. Many protests, if you read about protests in the news, you'll find started as a non-violent protest, a non-violent march, and then escalated into a violent process. So some people who start a non-violent protest, it then leads to a violent protest, often because of the atmosphere sometimes, or pressure from outside, or people mixed up in it who want it to turn violent, and so try and move things that way. When it comes to religious people, we've got to get that spectrum back up. In terms of protest, most religious people say it's the right thing to do if you see something that's wrong to stand up. But again, most religious people would say that violent protest is wrong. But again, it would depend on where they put themselves on the spectrum of violence, going from all violence is evil through to violence is a tool. Most religious people would put themselves in the violence is evil category, or some would say it's a necessary evil. That's where most religious people are. However, there are few who would say that violence is a neutral tool that can be used from time to time. Okay, so let's think about some of our key concepts, these key ideas that we introduced in the last lesson. Peace. We know that most religious people want to move towards a peaceful society, that peace is the end goal for most religious people. Therefore, most religious people would say that peaceful protest is the only protest that's acceptable. Non-violent protest is the only way to protest. And let's think about justice. We have mentioned this already, but effectively most people protest because they've seen an injustice, they've seen something unfair that's occurring, and they want to do something about it. So the Black Lives Matter movement is really important there, in that black people are being treated unjustly, unfairly across the Western world, and people are standing up and saying that this is wrong. Another great example would be the student fees protest. So when the Liberal Democrats announced that they were going to scrap student tuition fees, and then got into power with the Conservatives, then student fees came up. Lots of people were very upset about that, very angry, and said, no, that's not fair. We voted for you because you said this, and now you're doing this. And so protest often happens because of an injustice. So we're going to pause here. I want you to have a go at some of these questions, and then when you're ready, unpause it and we'll look at the answers. Okay, team, so now it's time to check your understanding and see how you got on with those questions. So, question number 1, in your own words, explain what is meant by violent protest and give an example. So, violent protest is when you use a method that is going to cause harm to someone to get your message across. Or when you're saying no to something, or you're standing up for a reason or for someone's rights, and you're using a violent method of doing that that's potentially going to cause someone harm. An example of a violent protest would be a riot, or attacking a policeman, or attacking people, would all be examples of violent protest. What Bible verses suggest that violence is wrong? So there's a load of verses in the Bible. You could just say violence is wrong. Love your neighbor, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, don't take revenge. All of those you could use to say that violence is wrong. Why would many people say that Jesus was anti-violence? Well, you could say that Jesus was anti-violence because of his teaching. Most of his teaching had a pacifist ideology about it. Things that he taught were about peace and pacifism. But also, ultimately, when Jesus was arrested, he didn't fight back. When his friend stood up for him and chopped off one of the people who was trying to arrest him's ear, Jesus healed it. And he said, you know, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And then ultimately, Jesus, you know, if you look at Jesus' victory, he won that not by fighting, but by dying. So in many ways, everything that Jesus did was anti-violence. Why do some Christians view violence as a necessary evil? So some Christians would say that, you know, violence in itself is evil, but it could and should be used to stop something worse from happening. So we use the example of World War II, that Hitler was on the rise, that Nazism was moving through Europe, and it would have been wrong to have let that roll over everyone. It was right to stand up and use violence to stop that. Many Christians would say that. Number 5, religious people should never take part in a violent protest. Well, that's all down to you. This is for your opinion, this one. But hopefully you wrote things in tune with what we've said already about the teaching of Jesus, but also this idea that for some people, sometimes violence is a necessary evil. And it might be you wrote something about how they tried non-violent protests and that didn't work, and so violent protest was their last resort. Your extension there was to research examples from Buddhism, Judaism, and Hinduism, and to find out what Sikhism and Islam teach about violence. Hope you had a go at that too. So that brings us to the end of the lesson, and just to recap on that need to know. So you need to know today that on the whole, violence is seen as evil by most religious people. However, for some, it's a necessary evil that could and should be utilized to bring about a good outcome. Hope you enjoyed that today. Hope you learned something. Looking forward to seeing you next time.